Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I mentioned in my Victober TBR that when I was 12 or 13 years old, I started reading Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights just a day or two after finishing her sister Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre for the first time. I had absolutely loved Jane Eyre, and finishing the novel left me bereft and in search of another amazing book to console myself. I hoped that Wuthering Heights would be that book. After all, Emily and Charlotte lived together in a relatively remote area, published their books at almost the same time, and were next to each other on my library shelves. After beginning Wuthering Heights back then, I was sorely disappointed. While there are definitely some similarities between Jane Eyre and Catherine Earnshaw, between Mr. Rochester and Heathcliff, the two books are radically different. Of course, being different from Jane Eyre does not automatically mean a book is bad, but as a young adolescent in mourning after completing a book that I knew would forever change my life, the fact that Emily Bronte did not write exactly like her sister did was reason enough to hold a grudge against Wuthering Heights for many years. Yes, I was being totally unfair. So this month, to meet Kate's challenge to reread a Victorian classic, I gave Wuthering Heights a second chance. Finally, and this time I really enjoyed it. No, the book does not replace Jane Eyre at the top of my favorites list, or even make it anywhere near the top of that list, but I found a lot which really intrigued me about Emily Bronte's book, and I almost want to turn around and read it again immediately. Although I remembered more imagery than I expected after my 40-year hiatus, there was so much intricate detail weaving in and out over the course of what is actually a fairly short Victorian novel that I can imagine that reading yet again, this time with the ending in mind, would allow me to appreciate even more what Bronte was trying to do in this book. Because of my probably overly ambitious Victober TBR, I won't be flipping back to chapter 1 just yet, but don't be surprised if you see this book appear again on this channel. A side story before I get into my thoughts on this week's reread of Wuthering Heights, thoughts that will range from personal stories to a little bit of analysis about some of the literary strategies that intrigued me. When I was in college, a few of my best pals lived on the same floor I lived on, but in the dorm catty-cornered to my building. From my window, I could wave to them in their suite. We occasionally held up signs with big letters written in magic marker. Meal, meaning we were heading down to the cafeteria and would love company. Class, meaning we were heading to the academic quad, where most classrooms were, and wanted to know if anyone wanted to walk with us. As my friends and I chatted about our possibilities for communication over lunch one day, I jokingly suggested we should try Semiphore instead. One of my friends instantly stood up, pretending he was holding flags in his hands, and intoned, "Heathcliff!" I thought it was hysterical, and retold the story many times over the years. Embarrassingly, I did not get the reference until I was fairly recently telling the story to my son, who quickly texted me a link of the excellent Monty Python skit of Wuthering Heights translated into Semiphore. I'll link it below. So, I finished reading the book, sitting in my favorite reading chair with a candle lit beside me. Can I say I read by candlelight if it was still daylight? It was definitely reading by candlelight, right? I think one of the things I disliked about Wuthering Heights when I first read it all those years ago was how dislikable almost all the characters are. Although I now love many books where I don't really like or identify with any of the characters, that was not so true back then when I was an adolescent. I mentioned in my newbie tag video that the first books I really loved were Louisa May Alcott's Little Women and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Yes, I identified with all the sisters in the first and with Jane in the second, but I also knew I, as one of the few people my age named Hannah, was shown on the page as the housekeeper Hannah's, to both the Marches of Little Women and to the Rivers family in Jane Eyre. Wuthering Heights has no Hannah, But there is an interesting housekeeper, Nellie Dean, who's also one of the narrators. More about Emily Bronte's narrative style in just a second, but I think the author expected us to identify with Nellie far more than I think either Alcott or Charlotte Bronte had in mind. While she's opinionated and biased, perhaps gossipy and a little stodgy, Nellie Dean is also stable and, to some degree, supportive of a wide range of characters. She's also someone who seems to feel relatively at home in both the world of the domestic and the world of the wild, the two poles we see mirroring and reflecting each other throughout the novel. In Emily Bronte's novel, the act of narrating is complex and messy, turned in on itself in a way that makes the entire book feel more insular. Like a set of Russian dolls, narration nests inside narration. On the outer level, we have Lockwood writing his diary, occasionally from his own experience and occasionally from the writing of other characters, primarily from a text he transcribes from memory of housekeeper Nellie Dean's long account of the lives of Catherine, Heathcliff, and their relatives. Like Lockwood's primary telling, Dean's account also relies sometimes on other characters' letters and diaries. In other words, while there are two main narrators, not shifting back and forth so much as layering upon each other, there are many times in Wuthering Heights when we presumably get a more complicated chorus of voices, a polyphonic narrative. Through these narrative techniques, which predate modernist styles but in many ways foreshadow them, we get an unstable narrative. What we have is in no way omniscient. We don't know exactly what happens. Honestly, I'm not totally convinced that Emily Bronte uses this complex narrative strategy completely effectively, but it's fascinating, and it gives the sense of a story wrapped around itself so tightly that the reader can't quite breathe. The two major narrators represent polar opposites in several ways. We have one male narrator and one female, a narrator from the south of England and one from the north, an outsider to the world of Wuthering Heights, and an insider, a relatively upper-class master and one working-class servant. This balance of two opposing narrative backgrounds fits well with all the other claustrophobic doubling and mirroring going on throughout the narrative. We start with two houses, although they're not alike in dignity as the two houses are in the famous prologue of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. The two houses are literally Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, and the two families, the Earnshaws and the Lintons. We see a house of wildness and passion, contrasted with a house supposedly made civil with domesticity, although there are hints of violence and danger there as well. Storylines echo each other quite closely as we move from the first generation to the second generation. Perhaps the most obvious is that Hindley degrades Heathcliff in the first part, and Heathcliff degrades Hareton in the second. Even the characters mirror each other in a collapsing puzzle where everyone is also someone else. Housekeeper Nellie Dean in one place is housekeeper Zillah in the other. Heathcliff in one storyline is replaced with Hareton in the other. Catherine Earnshaw Heathcliff Linton is quite literally mirrored by Catherine Linton Heathcliff Earnshaw. Just as the narrative style helps emphasize the stifling tone which Bronte creates, so does the extensive and overlapping doubling that makes every action repeat itself and makes the reader feel trapped inside this insular world of the desolate moors. When I read this book again, I want to talk about how Wuthering Heights raises the issue of both racial identity and the fallout of abuse and trauma, but for now I want to mention the power of the ending of the novel. In the first part of the book, we learn the story of Heathcliff and Catherine, with their intense passion and complicated twinning. When painting these two characters, Emily Bronte has created unlikable characters who nevertheless leave an indelible mark on us as readers. They're our main protagonists, the ones that move the book forward even after they die. But in the second part of the book, the far less compelling characters of Hareton and the younger Catherine move toward a gently accepting and almost tentative love. Despite the incredibly dark and brooding mood of the book as a whole, the relationship between Hareton and the younger Cathy is the beginning of reconciliation, a sense of healing and hope, Again, I think of Romeo and Juliet. The passionate and overly dramatic young lovers are dead, but the families are left to carry on and are now able to start figuring out a new way to go forward. Thanks for joining me today. See you next time on Hannah's Books.